is taking every step we can to communicate with, coordinate with, engage with big global suppliers around the world to minimize the impact on the energy markets.
But even without all this going on, gas in California is almost $5 a gallon. Should people across the country expect to see that kind of a number when they go to gas up their car? $5, $6?
Well, again, I think as you heard the president say last week, standing up for our values is not without cost.
There it is. There it is. Standing up for our values is not without cost. Oh, I love that line. I love that line. I want to bring in my guests. We're joined with Nebojša Malić. He's a Serbian-American journalist, blogger, and translator who wrote a regular column for antiwar.com from 2000 to 2015 and is now. Are you still a senior writer at RT, Nebojša?
Was.
No, say it one more time. I'm sorry.
I was the senior writer at RT.
Was. Okay, fair enough. Was a senior writer. Man, thank you for joining me. I really do appreciate it. I've always liked your take on issues associated with Europe. And there's right much now going on with Europe. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure. Happy to be on the show.
Thanks, man. I love that line by Jen Psaki. Our values are not without cost. We have to pay for our values. And the reason why I bring that clip up is because of what the U.S. and what Joe Biden has just done with these sanctions that they're applying to Russia right now. I didn't initially bring you on, but this was something that popped up in the media. Give me your take on that. I mean, this is something that, and by the way, not just the sanctions that Joe Biden passed, Ukraine deciding we're not going to now allow energy to go through our pipeline. So Europe, sucks for you. Give me your take on this. I'm fascinated by this, especially the hit that is going to take place to various countries in Europe now. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's easy for Jen to say this when she's not the one paying the price. Like this is supreme cynicism. She's got an MSNBC show now because even she couldn't handle the BS required to be the spokesperson for this outgoing administration. But yeah, I'm sorry, it's easy to talk about, values and cost when you're not the one bearing it, when that cost is getting basically put onto the people of California, North Carolina, Texas, Florida, New York City. It's the Americans paying the price for what exactly? What is the value in question that, we don't, we don't invade countries, but what was 1999 then? What was the NATO war against Serbia and then the occupation of Kosovo? Well, that was different. No, it wasn't. And this talk about taking Greenland if need be by force, that's annexation. Okay, so much for moral superiority. This whole thing, as you mentioned, this whole, waiting to sanction oil up until the very last week of this whole charade of the Biden administration. And let's face it. They basically admitted that Joe Biden has been non-compos mentis for years and that it was never, ever lucid. And they covered up for him throughout these 4 years. So they've admitted that he was their puppet. So I'm not going to blame him for anything. The man doesn't know where he is or what he is anymore. But so whoever was running, JoeBiden.exe, decided to do this as the final screw you to the A, American people who voted for Trump, and B, Trump. All of these, legacy media outlets are going to say, oh, well, this is all Trump's fault. The oil prices went up under Trump. Trump, orange man, bad, whatever. We've heard this a million times over the past 8 years. Nobody cares anymore. But, they seem to be punishing their allies more so even because, let's face it, as you mentioned, Biden tried to ban oil drilling in America. Fine, Trump is going to reverse that because that's executive orders. They can be countermanded. Right. But let's say that, Americans are going to be fine with their oil and gas needs for the sake of argument. But you've got these allies in Europe who are basically not sovereign countries. They're doing whatever the U.S. tells them to do. Yep. And they're the ones being screwed over because they can't import any more oil and gas from Russia. German industry, the economic engine of Europe, is basically shutting down, is dying a very slow, painful, poisoned death because they can't afford energy. Folks from the State Department and Treasury like to talk about molecules of freedom that are actual phrase, for this liquefied American natural gas, but there's no infrastructure to export it, so it only whatever gets shipped off gets shipped, gets delivered at, as you said, 5 times the price. Well, I'm sorry, anybody who's run a small business, you don't need to be a small business owner to understand that when your input costs rise 5 times, your profit margin disappears.
Yeah.
So, and it's not a fact, it's not a factor of we're going to pay the CEOs less. It's a factor of we can't sell our product because it's too expensive for anybody to buy.
Yep.
And this is what's happening in Germany. You have centuries-old businesses shutting down because they can't afford the energy bills. Now, admittedly, it's not entirely the U.S. sanctions' fault. It's also the fault of the Germans being stupid and giving up nuclear power. But it's sort of a perfect storm of stupidity, malice, and incompetence that's hitting this. Now, the most recent sanctions actually targeted the Serbian oil and gas company that has nothing to do with Russia. Serbia is neutral. I lived in Belgrade for the past year. Serbia is neutral. It literally said, we don't want to be on anybody's side in this fight. For all of the American media saying traditional ally of Russia, no, there's no contract of alliance. Yes, we used to be allies in World War I and World War II. So were we with Americans? What's your point?
Right.
But, Serbia is basically saying we don't want to side with either Russia or Ukraine here. We're open to actually hosting peace talks. They just offered to host the peace talks between Trump and Putin. But Serbia is being targeted by these sanctions in the last week of the Biden stage show. Why? Because they can. Here we have the spectacle of some sort of deputy assistant undersecretary who's got 4 days worth of office budget he needs to blow, visiting Serbia and going, you must do this, you must do that. No, we must do nothing.
Yeah.
We're going to deal with the boss once he gets sworn in. Go away. But the government here is saying, oh no, we are so very small, we are so very weak, we must. No, why are you doing this? This is a hostile act. An economic blockade is an act of war. This is what people have seemed to have forgotten because nobody's dared oppose the United States ever since Serbia in the 1990s. But economic sanctions, the ones that haven't been voted by the UN, and even the UN ones are sketchy, that's an act of war. You're literally being targeted for economic warfare.
We've been doing it. We've been doing it unilaterally. I mean, it hasn't even been a situation where, like you said, this is not something that has been agreed upon. The U.S. just does it willy-nilly. And, just to make the point clear, the U.S. has decided to loot its allies, and to take a phrase from somebody. I mean, if you think about it, the amount of money that we've been putting out. So Trump comes in and says, hey, NATO, now we need you to give 5%. Okay, well, what is that 5% for? Well, it's for U.S. weapons. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the overwhelming majority of that money is just going to the U.S. to get weapons or whatever materials that they're going to get when they increase the budget to the 5%. The Ukraine war, where was most of that money going? Most of that money was coming to the U.S. for U.S. weaponry that we were going to, once again, supply to Ukraine. The increase in energy costs. Okay, again, if we're paying 5 times more, if Europe is paying 5 times more, who is it paying 5 times more to? Our energy companies. When those companies in Europe go belly up, what do they go? They come to the U.S. because our energy costs are cheaper. Like, all of this stuff is effectively taking money and draining it from Europe and putting it into the U.S., even when they blew up the pipeline. Again, who did that damage? That damaged Europe. And now Ukraine, who is effectively a vassal of the U.S., has made the decision, entirely on its own, of course, to stop energy going into Europe through its own pipelines, which is going to damage various countries, Slovakia, for example.
Well, I was going to address that. So, basically, you've got Slovakia and Hungary who are already skeptical towards this whole, unilateral, unconditional support for Ukraine business in Brussels anyway. And Brussels is trying to blackmail and pressure them on that account. And now you have Ukraine basically breaking these. It's interesting to point out, the West is supposed to hold contract sacred, right? It's all about property rights and contract law. And this is what, makes the West civilized and everybody else a savage, right? That's the doctrine that all of these good institutions people are putting out. Great. Who has been respecting all of their contracts for the past 3 years?
Russia.
Yeah. Who is it that has been breaking all of their contracts for the past 3 years and longer? Not Russia. Russia's enemies. Interesting to point out. That's one. 2, so the funniest thing here is that Ukraine is actually importing electricity from Hungary and Slovakia because because a lot of their electric generation was destroyed by Russian airstrikes, which were reprisal for Ukrainian terror attacks. Essentially, if anybody remembers their World War II history, the Nazis were launched these rockets into England that had no military application whatsoever. They were just terrorizing British civilians as a way to, tell their public, oh, we're striking back at the British, whatever. But, V1, V2 rockets, they actually expended scarce resources that the Nazis couldn't spare, but, Hitler was obsessed with them, so that's what they did. The
Yep.
Ukrainians are launching these drones against civilian buildings in Russian territory to say, oh, we're bombing Russia, we're striking back, whatever. And the Russians are responding by basically turning off the lights. And so now the Ukrainians have to import electricity from Hungary and Slovakia. And I'm actually kind of shocked that neither Orban nor Fico, the prime ministers of Hungary and Slovakia, haven't said, fine, you've shut off our gas, no more power for you. Because they'd be perfectly in the rights to do so.
Yeah, the way they threatened it, Fico has threatened it. I don't know if he's gone through with it.
I don't know if they've gone through with it either, but they've been talking about it for weeks and months because the Ukrainians were making threats and they haven't followed through. It's just one of those. It seems like the world is reverting to whatever you can get away with, you can do, which is not civilized, but I believe somebody wrote a book called Management of Savagery that seems to be perfectly descriptive about this. And I don't know, I doubt that the book was about this in particular, but it comes to mind unbidden because that's what we're dealing with. It's savagery. People are saying, well, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must, which is fine if you believe yourself to be strong, as long as you are actually strong. But when you're not, it doesn't work out that way. And a lot of people are about to find out the hard way that they're not as strong as they thought. Because again, you mentioned GDP. How do you convert GDP that's based on financial services into artillery shells? You don't. You need industry. You need tangible products. You need, factories. You don't have factories. People who know how to make these things have either been forced into retirement because they're too old, too white, too male, too whatever, or there was a vax mandates and all of these other clever things. Let's bring in more. I don't know. The LA Fire Department type representation into this business. Well, who's going to make your shells?
Yeah.
This is, and of course Europe, being energy deprived, can't really produce things. And so now you've got a situation in which the Americans, let's face it, the US has a 5-sided hole in the budget. It's called defense spending. It's not defense spending, it's offensive spending.
Yeah.
In every respect. And that is not 5% of GDP. That's something like 3.5. I think Poland spends more percentage-wise, but they don't have domestic military industry, so they have to buy everything from the outside. But nobody in the West can spend that much. Nobody. That 5% to ask from Trump is insane. And I think it's deliberately such that it can be that it's impossible, so people can't do it, so he has an excuse to do something else afterwards, whether take Greenland as payment or whatever. So it's a deliberately impossible ask. But even if they somehow could, it's not how much you spend, it's what you buy with your dollars.
Yes.
Because the Russians are spending, right now, they're spending 6.5, I believe Putin was saying. And they're getting Oreshniks and all these, sophisticated weapons that actually work on the battlefield. Whereas the Americans are spending $1 billion per F-35, which doesn't really work. So that's also got to factor in.
I've said the same thing, that, it's the bang for the buck. It's return on investment that matters. Like, we use the $1 trillion a year as our military parades. It's our way of saying, look at how much we spend on our military. Don't screw with us. But it's what you get for that. Like, it has to actually match the battlefield that you're fighting on for it to matter. If you're spending $1 trillion and it doesn't match up to what you're spending it on. Kamala Harris spent $1.5 billion on a race and lost it to somebody who spent $300 million. So it's not just the money. I agree with you. It's what you're spending the money on. I am curious. And I'm sorry, I broke into I intruded upon your stream of thought, but you are right. We have a hole in our budget. Nobody ever analyzes the amount of money that we spend on our military in regards to what we're spending it on, the bang for the buck, whether it's indicative of the current battlefield that we're effectively fighting on. You're 1,000% correct. One of the things I want to hit is this notion of European quote unquote democracy. And the reason I'm putting it in quotes is because I have watched Georgia, well, for one, I've watched Ukraine get taken down in a revolution in Maidan coup, what a literally overthrew the government, called it a revolution of dignity, and has ignored the fact that it was an actual coup. The democratically elected government of Yanukovych was effectively overthrown. Then I watched them do something similar in Georgia, where they did any and everything in their power with the French-born Georgian president working with the EU to destroy that government using a sort of Maidan tactic for it. And then I watched it again in Romania, where a court gets involved to strike down an election because they didn't necessarily like the person who was going to win it, calling it TikTok videos by the Russians. Coming to find out, it wasn't the Russians at all. It was their own government that had invested money into the electoral campaign. I want to get your take on this. So this is former European Commissioner Thierry Breton. And something that should be a mark of shame, he is effectively saying, hey, we have tools to deal with countries like Germany, because at this point, German government, the AFD, may actually take power in Germany as a direct result of the German government going in with European, let's say, orthodoxy, and just blowing off the best interests of the public for U.S. Security concerns. So this is theory. I want you to hear what he says, and I want to get your take on this.
Le poids de la parole, attendons ce qui va se passer, et pour l'instant, gardons notre sang-froid et faisons appliquer nos lois en...
Okay, he's speaking French. So this...
I actually watched that clip before, and I understand what he's saying. He says, but, my staff wrote this law. We have the law that enables us to do in Germany what we did in Romania. So, to protect our democracy, we're going to do to Germany what we did in Romania. I'm like,
thank you.
That's actually as close to a literal quote as I can get. But it's shocking. Like, this is the guy who actually resigned because von der Leyen didn't want to back him up when he went after Elon Musk.
And by the way, he's bragging about this.
Yeah, he's absolutely bragging. He's absolutely bragging.
Have the
and
law.
It's disgraceful. So his staff wrote it. So here's the thing. What happened in Ukraine in 2014, without going into too much detail, was the second color revolution in a decade. They had so the first color revolution of modern times was the first color revolution in let's say 21st century was in Serbia in 2000, in October 2000.
Yes.
And it was the general test for this what was going to happen afterwards. They ran that same script in Georgia in 2003, which is where Salome was. She was the French ambassador to Georgia at the time, and the coup president gave her citizenship and appointed her foreign minister. That's how she got Georgian citizenship. She didn't speak the language or anything. Mm-hmm. And then it was tested again in 2004 in Kiev. The Guardian, of all places, has an article about how the U.S. has figured out how to win other people's elections and was bragging about what they did with the Orange Revolution in Kiev in 2004. They've tried it elsewhere, and the Arab Spring of 2011 was supposed to be the same thing, but it failed and it turned bloody, and because people had by that point figured out a lot of these tricks. They keep trying, and the US has this whole NGO industry that keeps trying, and the EU has a similar sort of overlay. But the idea is you basically hijack democracy. If you get a result you don't like in an election, you hijack democracy. You create a popular protest, or you hijack a justified popular protest, and you bring in your own people and you claim that's democracy. Yep. It's pernicious. It's democracy destroying. It's toxic. It's corrosive. Now, what happened in Georgia is that the ruling party won the election fair and square. All the observers said it was fair and square, and the president said, "No, I deny it. You cheated." What evidence do I have? Well, just a feeling that the Russians interfered. I don't have to prove anything. The Americans said it, so they didn't need any proof. She was literally invoking Russiagate to justify.
Yes, she was.
It.
And by the way, she literally said that, just for the audience. He's not making it. She literally said, it's a feeling. She was like, I can't prove it. And she even says, the Americans, with all of the money that they have at their disposal, well, they couldn't prove it. So
they couldn't they couldn't prove it, so that's good enough for them. And so she invoked Russiagate, which we all know is bogus. They admitted it was bogus. She obviously didn't get the memo, and then she tries to overthrow the government, fails. The government, to their great credit, does not, break up these protests by force. They very politely let these people scream into the void and then inaugurate the president normally and go about their business. And they respond to the EU by saying, fine, you don't want us, we don't want you either.
Yep.
Massive props to them, because that's dignity, that's sovereignty, that's the way to do this. And she goes and gets a job at the McCain Institute, thereby proving that she's been a stooge all along. Whatever. And then you have Romania, in which in the first round of the elections, the guy who wins the most votes, but not quite 51%, is this, conservative independent candidate, let's say conservative, socially conservative for Romania, who's basically like, no, I like Romania, I don't like war. We shouldn't be a puppet of Brussels. We should be a sovereign country. And the TikTok campaign promoting him was actually arranged by one of the establishment parties that failed to qualify in the first round. They thought too much of their own chances. And it's the same playbook as this new knowledge campaign in 2017 in Alabama, which is a Democrat-funded shop that was smearing the Republican Senate candidate as being, backed by Russians, Russian bots or whatever. The Russian bots were theirs. They were the Russian bots. And then they went on to advise the Senate on Russian tactics, which I suppose they were uniquely qualified because they were the ones LARPing as Russians. Anyway, and this was a scandal even in the US. The New York Times thought of this as odious, and they had to shut down and rebrand and whatever. So this is happening in Romania, and then the Romanian Supreme Court basically says, oh, there was a Russian campaign on TikTok, we're canceling. We're not just, we're annulling the election and canceling it. So that the president whose mandate has expired can continue being president. That's like, I don't know, the US Supreme Court deciding that November 6th didn't happen because somebody said something on TikTok and therefore Joe Biden is president for life.
It's astonishing. It really is astonishing. I've never seen anything like it.
And none of the people in the EU or the US who sort of made their political careers out of advocating for democracy promotion or protection or whatever, nobody has said a word. And in fact, as we just saw Thierry Breton saying, yeah, we did it and we'll do it again. I'm sorry, what? What legitimacy do you have?
He's bragging about it. Like he is literally bragging about it. We have shut down an election because we didn't like the result. And now, Germany, the beating heart of Europe, comes up with a result we don't like. We'll do it again.
But here's the thing. I don't think the AFD will win the election, even if they win the majority or the largest block of it, because Germany has a proportional system. This is how the European governments have been cheating their citizens for decades. They have this proportional system, and so it doesn't matter who wins the largest block of votes. If the two other parties put together 50% plus one, they get the prime minister. This is what happened in Poland. The old ruling party that I had issues with, but they were sovereignist and, skeptical of Brussels. They're also rapidly Russophobic. So, that policy continued no matter who's in charge. But the old Polish government was like, okay, fine, we got like 47%. We're still the largest bloc. We should form a government. But these two, little green fringe parties or whatever they were called, they're like, no, we don't feel like making a coalition with you. We're going to make a coalition with this Brussels liberal Democrat, whatever, and they're going to have a government that's literally like 50% plus 0.1%, barest of bare majorities mathematically, and they're running as if the country as if they had absolute sovereign mandate. Like a mandate. In France, Macron literally manipulated last year's election, presidential one, because not presidential, sorry, the parliamentary. He called the snap election thinking that he's going to profit from it because he wanted to stop Marine Le Pen and her national rally from getting the majority. And then when they got the majority in the first round, he's like, okay, he made a deal with this ultra-leftist bloc. They called themselves the Popular Front. And I'm not just throwing labels around. They really consider themselves ultra-leftist. Anyway, he made a deal with them. Okay, well, we're going to join forces with you to screw over Le Pen and the National Rally because they're Nazis or whatever.
Right.
And then we're going to rule, we're going to make a coalition afterwards. And then the moment that happened, he's like, oh, yeah, by the way, that deal we made, screw you. We're not putting you into government. I'm going to put in a minority prime minister who's going to be from my pocket party, and you guys can go F off.
It was like a mini coup, yeah.
Right. And so these people are obviously upset, and they've actually joined Marine Le Pen and the National Rally in December, early December, to vote no confidence to the first government. And then Macron appointed another pocket prime minister. And
Yep.
so the National Front leader, Mélenchon, is like, you can keep putting in new prime ministers every 3 months. We're going to keep knocking them down. You're not going to outlast your mandate. You might as well resign. And Macron is saying, never.
Yeah.
That's democracy. Jefferson was right. Governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. European governments, first of all, are not sovereign because whatever they do, Brussels overrides them. And Brussels is ruled by unelected bureaucrats. Nobody voted for Ursula von der Leyen. Nobody. Secondly, the national governments that are determined to follow Brussels, they just completely ignore the will of their voters and cancel elections, like what happened in Romania, like what, or make them meaningless, like what happened in France. I am convinced that this is going to happen in Germany because, the German government is so thoroughly cucked, they're just going to say, oh, these people are dangerous. If they win the elections, we're going to have to cancel the elections, or we're going to, set up another mathematical coalition. Even
How
though this
how do they pull that off? I mean, like you must understand from the U.S. point of view, our elections are like sacrosanct. They're just it's like a force of nature. They just are. It would be shocking for a court to come in and say, "Hey, by the way, that election doesn't exist now." I don't even know if we would have any precedent for it in this
we
country.
wouldn't, but that's because the United States, and this has been the most difficult thing to explain to people here in Europe, because everybody's like, oh, we have toilets that are older than our knowledge of the Americas. Technically true, but the American statehood, the American political system, the United States of America is older than most European modern states, because a lot of, like the French, they have a constitution that goes back to the 1960s, I believe. Like they're on their fifth republic, and they've had a couple of empires. So France as a country has existed for longer, but the modern French government is relatively new. Britain has a system that goes way back. Fair. Germany was literally recreated by the Americans and the British and the French from the ashes of World War II.
Second World War.
So their system has all of these modern overrides. Romania, the Romanian constitution goes back to like 1991 because they were ruled by communists and they were a monarchy before that. So they're like their third or fifth form of government in the last 200 years.
Man, that's such a great point.
Yeah. So, Serbia, which is super traditional and everything, but our government basically dates back from 2000 to the color revolution. So again, for all of these, and you've got some legacy systems here and there, but in general, like I think the most recent Serbian constitution, and Serbia had like 10, the US has had one. But Serbia is on its 10th constitution. It was passed in like 2009, I want to say, or 11. Like it's new, and it's longer than the Patriot Act because it's so chock full of frankly pointless details. But whatever. The point is that a lot of these European countries are relatively new political systems, and they've bureaucrats that run them, especially with the EU constitution, the Lisbon Agreement, or whatever they call it, is dates back to the early 2000s, and it can override stuff, and it keeps getting updated on the sly by unelected people. To mean whatever they want it to mean. And we have laws written by this bureaucrat Breton and his crew that basically give them the power to do anything they want. And the worst part is you have no recourse. What are you going to do? Sue it to the Court of Human Rights? That can take years, and they always defer to the governments.
Well, that's
you can't rebel because there's no Second Amendment.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about the Romania part. Like they've been doing massive protests, trying to as a recourse for it. Has the Supreme Court set a new date for the election? What is the current recourse going on in Romania for Carl Gorgatscu? I may be mispronouncing the last name, but it's something to the effect, Carl Gorgatscu. What is his recourse?
He's basically taken to, there was a massive rally in Bucharest yesterday. I think it was north of 150,000 people. Everybody's waving Romanian flags and chanting and generally being very positive and cheerful. And they were booing most of the mainstream media because they were accusing them of being fake news. And they were cheering for this one or two independent outlets that have been reporting fairly on this. But they basically are like, look, we had a revolution in '89 that overthrew the communist government. We can do this again if we're pressed. Don't usurp democracy. And so far, the government's like, yeah, screw you. We're just ignoring you. And most of the media in Europe, in the European Union, are like, yeah, no, nothing's happening.
This is outrageous.
It is.
I mean, like, this is like, I've never seen anything like this. Like, because from our point of view, Europe is supposed to be a representative democracy or constitutional democracy or parliamentary democracy, but the key word in there is representative of the public. And for the public to just get blown off, like, we're not going to accept this. Or in Georgia's case, we're not going to accept this. And we're going to get the entirety of the EU to put pressure to try to overthrow a government that we don't necessarily like. And again, for Ukraine, they did the same thing though. This is a revolution of dignity. And as you point, I guess my point of view of it, where I started paying attention, it was when the Ukraine war took place. But you're right. It goes back to the color revolutions that were taking place prior, showing something similar. It's just shocking to me that
that's why I keep saying that color revolutions are not a clever trick. They're toxic for the very institution of democracy. Because if you can hijack, it's like a mind virus, and if you can hijack this mechanism that's supposed to be representative of popular will, that the government draws legitimacy from, you render that government illegitimate. And this is the biggest problem. So basically, that government has to rely on two things to maintain its legitimacy: brute force and lies, propaganda.
Yeah.
And those are not legitimate. From the Jeffersonian standpoint, speaking as an American citizen, that's not legitimate.
No, it's not.
And and all of these governments basically just manufacture consent because they don't actually have it. Lincoln said that the American Republic, I don't know whether he called it democracy. I think it was a bit of a dirty word back in those days, but he said it was a government of the people, for the people, by the people, which a lot of people now quote as gospel truth. And let's assume that's the definition. The European Union is a government of the bureaucrats, for the bureaucrats, by the bureaucrats. It has nothing to do with the people, nothing whatsoever. If the national governments that are actually theoretically elected make a mockery of elections by these post-electoral coalitions and manipulations and simply canceling elections when they got the result they don't like. And if the European central government in Brussels makes a mockery of national governments by saying, well, it doesn't matter what your people voted for, you're going to do what we tell you, that's not democracy.
No,
that is a structure of lies.
And it seems like they're using what they consider to be the orthodoxy of that, let's say, overarching bureaucratic system to affect directly the local governments, to give this kind of mockery of a democratic system.
Now the gloves are off, and basically they're switching from manufacturing consent through the media, which isn't working anymore, to simply affecting brute force, to using
the mask is off.
Yeah, if they had tanks to send to Romania, they would have, but they sent them all to Ukraine, so they can't.
For Germany, though, I mean, Germany, that's a pretty, like, Romania is more, from the standpoint of the national press, it's understated. Germany is not. Germany is the beating heart of Europe, as they call it. Are they really going to be able to, I don't know, whitewash an election if it does come across that the AFD is more popular? And the reason why I asked that, it seems to be, when I was in, my ex is Austrian, she was from Austria. And you could see, I was there for the political election when they were doing the national elections. You can see a change in regards to the way that the Europeans are thinking about the war in Ukraine, for one, about their place in it, meaning they're sick and tired of putting all of this money and resources into the Ukraine project. And you can see it in Germany. I mean, the fact that Scholz is like, I want to talk to Putin, I want to talk to Putin. Okay, well, all of a sudden, do you want to talk to Putin? He can see it on the ground that the public is getting sick of the direction that Germany political wing is going. And so when you get this new, the AFD saying, we're sick of this, yeah, we want to turn back on Nord Stream, or being very loud saying, this war is not about Ukraine, this war is about the United States taking advantage of Europe. Okay, well, I suspect that the AFD is saying that because that is a popular opinion in Germany, and Scholz, who now has to backpedal on the stuff that he was going with before, either on immigration or for that matter on the war, knows it. So, like, it seems to be that that's not just Germany, that it seems to be Europe as a whole, meaning a wave going through Europe against many of the policies that the German government and many of the bureaucrats, as we call them, have been running with. So how on earth do you really think they're going to be able to overcome the will of what seems to be the Europe as a whole at this point, who seems to be trying to push in a different direction?
Well, I want to be optimistic about this, but unfortunately, I've watched the EU do this for years and decades, and the politicians in Brussels are absolutely insulated from any sort of accountability. Basically, it's the national governments that get beat up for bad policy, and Brussels who does whatever the hell it wants because it knows that they can privatize any sort of benefit and socialize any sort of pain. Kind of like that there's a price on our values, but somebody else gets to pay it. So the thing that they're doing to AFD is they're smearing them as Nazis because the Germans are, perhaps rightly so, conditioned to consider any sort of Nazi revival anathema because of what happened in World War II. And as
And I accept that.
so do I. I mean, I have relatives who died in that war. We were under German occupation here in what used to be Yugoslavia. It was very brutal. We fought them. I mean, it was a very brutal war, and there's no sympathy here in my household for Nazism of any kind.
1,000% agree with you.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that the German government is correct about smearing. It's one of those. I don't want anybody unjustly smeared as a Nazi because that robs that particular moniker of its power.
Yes.
This is the same German government that doesn't have a problem with Nazis so long as they're in Ukraine fighting Russia. So they don't have a problem with Nazis on principle. So they're calling AFD Nazis to trigger this, mental block in the German population. Oh, I can't vote for Nazis. Well, you're not voting for Nazis. You're voting for somebody who's opposed to this idiotic government's policy that's brought you nothing but ruin. And arguably, people shouldn't be using these nuclear political accusations inappropriately, because if you overuse them, they lose their power. And once they do lose their power, chances are you might actually end up with actual Nazis, because we've seen, as per Ukraine, that they do exist. You might end up with actual Nazis coming back, and you can't stop them at that point because the magic word doesn't work anymore.
Or what these liberal governments are doing in regards to control. I mean,
but they're desperate. They're resorting to brute force and lies because that's all they have left. They can't promise anybody a better life or a better future because they've failed to deliver on it. And so their default, policy is basically shut up and do as we tell you, because otherwise you're a bad person.
See, that's the other irony of it. Do you remember the speech, I believe it was Rutt made, saying that the Europeans have to give up their living standards or European living standards? Effectively saying, in order to keep Europe this garden, we need to effectively pay more money for defense and give up on security benefits that we typically would typically get for a European. I mean, this stuff is outrageous. And so I agree with you. And using the Nazi thing, there's no room or coddling Nazis in this case. But the reason that people are moving to the AFD is not because they're Nazis. It's because they're their only outlet to stop liberal policy. I mean, it's kind of this liberal orthodoxy that many of the groups who are getting smeared as right-wing groups are just saying, look, we're looking out for the best interests of whatever this country is, whether it's Romania or Georgia, or pick any random country that you want to put in, Slovakia, where we want the best interests of us, not necessarily the best interests of this quote-unquote European project that keeps involving us in wars. That's the wild part about it. And it seems to be right-wing parties that seems to be focusing on this notion of what is in the best interest of whatever this particular country is, whether it's Romania first, or Slovakia first, or Croatia first, who just elected a right-wing guy who doesn't necessarily want to be involved in war. Do you, regardless of what the bureaucracy is doing in Europe, it still seems that they may be failing in their ultimate task of keeping this project going, especially with Donald Trump coming into office. How do you think Trump affects that? I mean, are they going to be able to continuously, have this kind of liberal orthodoxy overthrowing governments while Trump is in office? If that makes sense.
Trump isn't necessarily going to support, block them from overthrowing governments, overthrowing a government of Romania or even Slovakia. He doesn't know Fico from a fiat.
The
But
national governments, though, he complained about the fact that they were seemingly intruding upon the elections of national governments.
well, he
Nationalistic.
might stand up for Orban because Orban is a friend.
Yeah.
If they go after Orban, they might actually have to deal with Trump. But I don't think he's going to interfere too much in internal European, EU matters. Now, Musk, on the other hand, is probably, uh, and who knows? Maybe he's coordinating with Trump. Maybe Trump, doesn't think it's appropriate for a U.S. president to make these announcements, but it's perfectly appropriate for his first buddy, who happens to own the world's biggest megaphone, to say things that Trump can't say. Something.
Right.
I mean, that could be it. I don't know. I'm not part of the White House inner circle by any stretch of imagination, but I honestly, here's the paradoxical thing about the European project. All of these people in Brussels have this fantasy that they're building an independent economic, political, and even military bloc. They're not. The whole point of the globalist American empire is that to never allow an independent Europe of any kind. It has to be economically, politically, but most importantly, militarily enslaved to NATO and the United States in order for the globalist American empire to continue functioning. That's sort of an article of faith. Ask any sort of Beltway liberal, they will tell you this. So what's essentially this destruction of European economies is a plus for the globalist American empire.
Exactly.
Now, Trump is getting into office, and he's notionally opposed to this, and his whole talk about Greenland and Canada and Panama Canal and all this stuff is essentially a nationalist empire, that one that doesn't really care about these European vassals. It's going to extract from them whatever it can, but is not going to, fall for our sacred democracy, blah, blah, blah principles. He says, you have resources, I want them.
Right.
Mine. And that itself is going to undermine this globalist project. But he's not going to go into Europe overthrowing governments. Maybe he should, but he's not going to do that, because that's not, he's focusing on snatching resources for American control, which is an implicit admission that the globalist project has failed, and that the globe divided into combatant commands of the U.S. military is no more. But again, that's a different topic for a different time.
No, that's the main point.
Yeah, but I wish at this point, I really wish somebody would kick the European Union around the way it's used to kicking other people, just to give them a taste of their own medicine.
He is. He's effectively
show them how it. Yeah.
Well, he's effectively trying to take down Greenland. And, Greenland has come back saying we want our independence. We don't necessarily want to be Americans, but we do want our independence. And, of course, what Trump wants, I agree with you entirely, a larger America. I think he looks out at the world. He sees China and Russia, how dominant they are, one in technology, the other one in industry. And he's insecure, and he's looking for a way to deal with that insecurity, this kind of fortress America, with this idea that Greenland...
But that means throwing Europe overboard. That means throwing the EU under the bus, getting rid of it as ballast. And so all of a sudden, ironically, this may give the European bureaucrats what they've always wanted, but it would also make them actually responsible for their actions, which is something they hate as much as a vampire would hate a cross or a string of garlic. So it's going to put them... They're going to get what they wanted, and they're going to get it good and hard, and they're going to find out that that's not what they wanted at all.
But I didn't get the sense that they wanted America to pull away from Europe, meaning that was always the country,
they've always wanted the political and economic power, but have America be responsible for their military security. That's sort of the deal that was made after World War II. The American troops are going to stay in Germany and basically, ensure that no communist government is elected anywhere. And in return, the Europeans can, provide America with luxury goods and create fancy welfare states for their own people and show off as better than communism. That was the whole social contract during the Cold War. Well, the problem with these, generous welfare states is that they've attracted mass migration, which is causing all sorts of problems, and it has basically destroyed domestic societies. And all of a sudden now they're trying to get mobilized for a massive military campaign of industrial warfare, which they're not prepared for. And even if they were, their industry has just withered on the vine because of the American sanctions against Russian energy that they desperately needed. And so the social contract has been violated, and nothing better has come in to fill the void yet. And I think the Brussels bureaucrats are desperately trying to tread water and ensure that through inertia, the pretense of the old order is maintained, because they're deathly afraid of what might come next.
But they don't recognize what is happening to them. I mean, like, they're obviously, like, the amount of money they're putting out for either military, meaning with Ukraine coming into the US, for oil and gas that's coming into the US, like, that is a massive drain on resources, not to mention the wars where, this mass migration from, let's say, like Syria, for example, ends up going into Europe, destabilizing the politics. But they don't see it at all.
No, because they're divorced. They're so remote from it. As I mentioned, the Brussels bureaucrats are, most of them are unelected, and so they're so far removed from the consequences of their own actions that they think nothing of it. Somebody else pays the price for their values, as Saki put it. And so, it's just one of those. You can have, and because their delusions are, they're drinking from their own supply of Kool-Aid manufactured by the media, because they have the censorship regime that Breton is boasting about. They don't even know what the situation is on the ground. And if somebody dares tell them that, somebody gets punished, censored, run out of town, because how dare you mention this? Censor, censor, censor. You had 150 bureaucrats listening in on the call that Elon had with Alice Weidel of AFD, because we must make sure that she doesn't say something we disapprove of. That's not liberty. That's not democracy. That's not freedom of anything. That's a dictatorship. You guys are running a dictatorship straight out of Orwell. What is wrong with you?
Yeah, it's bizarre.
Again, it doesn't register with them.
That's bizarre. Neb, man, thank you for this. Great segment. I got to have you back, man. Nebojša Mališ, he's a Serbian-American journalist, blogger, and translator who wrote a regular column for antiwar.com from 2000 to 2015. Neb, thank you for this, man.
Thanks
Great
for having
job.
me.
You have a good one. All right. I want to go to my